All right, guys, we're at AWS reInvent 2022 here in Vegas, and we just happened to run into each other in the hall talking about the difference of this conference versus previous AWS reInvents and even other like open source conferences. Anthony, what's been your experience over the years?
Yeah, I mean, I came to my first reInvent in 2017, right? And it was big, but from a Veeam perspective, when we were, it was hard to have a conversation about all things, AWS related versus backup related. But, 5 years later, 5 or 6 years later, I think it's five, this is my third one. And, we're having great conversations. There's more excitement around the booth. People are actually, getting attracted into what, we're doing. But then also, I think just this whole realization that data is so important. That's obviously been a narrative that's been pushed for the last 3 or 4 years, right? But then I'm just hearing in every sort of hallway, walking down the Venetian and whatnot, people saying, I've got to get the data in, and what do we do about the data? Like, that's become such a central part of everyone's thought process. So it kind of validates where we are as, Veeam and as just general technologists and what we've been kind of talking about for a long time. So it's really exciting. There's so many people. And I think it's a really, really good event to be back in person as well.
And then, Michael, we're just talking about just the difference in transformation in who we're talking to. It's not just developers anymore needing to do kind of the DevOpsy thing, but now we're seeing more sysadmins.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like sysadmin-wise, the data's always been more relevant. Maybe they once were looking after the data on premises in their vSphere environments, but now the company needs to expand that and have that in the public cloud, and they still have to have that responsibility to protect that data. It's like you mentioned around like open source conferences as well. The difference there, exactly the same, that trend of the sysadmin evolving and having a bit more of responsibility around the data and the workload to a degree, but generally the data, how do we protect it? How do we restore it if bad things happen? Because they're going to happen. So I think there's an evolution of the sysadmin role, having more focus around automation, more focus around what they can do with that data. How can we do more with less? That sort of like mindset is happening.
So, guys, let's have a seat and let's talk about kind of the sponsored part of this video and where Veeam is helping to customers navigate like these massive landscapes. What I'm discovering is that IT is not dying, like it's cumulative. There's VMware services, there's Kubernetes services, there's AWS has just announced a bevy of data services that, again, my mind went directly to kind of how do I protect that? Not just how I protect the underlying data, but how do I protect my work? Like with the value, Adam talked about the value and the transferability of the actual work, that at the end of the day, when I create a model, I need to protect the model. So let's talk about kind of the Veeam overall approach. Either one of you can give me an intro or overview of what's the Veeam approach to cloud and data protection in the cloud.
Yeah, I'll kick, like traditionally, right, obviously we're born in the virtualization world, we all know that, right? So we rode that wave really successfully. That's done and dusted. I've been at Veeam for 6 years, and I've seen the platform evolve to not just do your hypervisors, but also start to branch out into as a service with Microsoft stuff, but more specifically really push into the cloud space, right? Backing up, obviously AWS is why we're here, but the other public clouds that are out there, into the Kubernetes world, and we're evolving into that. So we really just sit there with this platform now, which we didn't have 6 years ago. We had a couple of solutions, and now we talk about the outcome. Like you said, you've got your data, how do you protect it? So we're really just facilitating that and trying to, talk to the industry, talk to the guys that Michael was describing. We're transitioning from on-premises, to a more hybrid world. You do have that group of people that are just the DevOpsy, the serverless guys who, they're the harder ones to have the conversations with. But if we can kind of bridge that, then our value becomes pretty good, right?
Yeah, so Michael, let's talk about kind of the bridging the worlds, because I kind of think of you as the casting evangelist. Whenever I think of what Veeam is doing when it comes to Kubernetes and cloud native backup, you're kind of my first button to kind of press on the phone of who to talk to. But the vision is much bigger now than just Kubernetes and traditional VM backups or even EC2 backup. Talk to me kind of the workflow. When I'm thinking about backing up my apps, how should I be thinking about that now?
So first and foremost, it's generally focused on the application, and that doesn't matter whether it's a virtual machine, physical, cloud native type approach. But like to Anthony's point about like serverless or like we won't get into like WebAssembly or anything like that, but
WebAssembly is one of our favorite topics, but go ahead.
But generally speaking, if we think about like where does our app send the data, or where does it store the data? It's generally going to be some sort of database, some sort of data service. A database can live in a virtual machine, a physical. Way back, it had to be physical, and then that's evolved. Whether you want to run that database inside of Kubernetes or inside of RDS, for example. But the database is going to be there, or the serverless might even leverage that database. But how do we protect that? Now, like from a demo point of view, we bring out failure scenarios like just dropping databases. Now that shouldn't really happen in a production, but it's a good way of simulating a huge failure. But accidents do happen. They can encrypt them databases. So how do we protect the data or the database as part of that whole application? So you might have your application running in Kubernetes, or it might be running in EC2. It might be that your database runs in RDS. It might run as an EC2 instance. It might run as a VM. And you have to look at all of that. So I think from my focus is that all the data doesn't always have to live in a container or in a Kubernetes environment. We have customers that are using, like Kasten, for example, that protect RDS plus the front end application that lives inside of Kubernetes, which gives them the scalability and the flexibility of that. And then it just hooks into a Postgres RDS instance or some sort of Aurora type MySQL instance over in the AWS for latency, etc. So yeah, there's a lot of flexibility in terms of that, but we have to think about the overall application wherever that may be.
Yeah. And actually, so Michael and I did a demo that we did sort of this year, right, was where the same application was a basic WordPress site, but we had it across all sorts of those platforms, right? And the idea was that we broke every single one of them and we recovered them, with the Veeam tool set, right, the platform. But the application was central to that. So that was, I think, from what you're talking about, that was a pretty powerful way to show that it doesn't really matter where you're putting the data, where the application lives, you can protect it.
So we're going to talk about kind of this portability of workflow in a second, but you two have hit a point that when I talk to AWS architects or AWS executives, they have a tendency of drilling home this point of shared responsibility. There's what they do, and then there's what the end user organization or customer needs to do on their side.
Yeah.
What side of the field is Veeam playing on when that shared responsibility model?
Yeah, so I think customer data, in fact, AWS, their shared responsibility, they've got a really good post that talks about what they're responsible for and what you are as a customer. And customer data is a big rectangle in there that's very bold. So that, like we go back to the databases or data services, that is your responsibility. They'll keep the platform up. Ultimately, they're a big service provider, right? I'll let you touch on the service provider side, but ultimately they're providing a service. They're providing a platform that enables you to run databases, virtual machines, file systems, etc. But you put your stuff on it. That's your responsibility. They'll keep the infrastructure up, but the data's your responsibility.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of blurring a little bit though, right? Because obviously now they've got that shared responsibility model where they have that triangle, but then they've got their backup products as well. So it's almost like there's a little bit of a, coming together where they're going, okay, well, you can be responsible for it using our tool set as well, right? So we absolutely love that because it validates where we are in terms of the backup for AWS product, which we build on top of their platform, talk to their APIs and in a special way in their primitives to create a product that leverages our portable data format. It increases efficiencies and lets you sort of back up EC2, VPCs, RDSs in a Veeamy way, right? Which people love. So and the way that I talk about it, especially we're seeing quite a few services companies that are moving into consulting for AWS, and they're wondering how can they make money off managed services for backup as workloads move from the cloud, from on-premises to the cloud. And that is absolutely the way, So we can offer these services, they can control it from a central point, and just basically continue to get the best of both worlds.
So let's talk a little bit more about that managed service provider story, because this has been a difficult period of transition for most managed service providers.
Yeah.
When I was backing up my data set via managed service provider to another cold site via Veeam, it was a very clean solution. But now I'm introducing Kubernetes, I'm introducing RDS, I'm introducing VMs and other types of compute, and managed service providers are kind of stuck. There was no centralized resource that could do that entire landscape of services. Are there now managed service providers that can now go to and say, hey, you're based on Veeam, I talked to Anthony and Michael, can you now back up all of these other assets for me?
Yeah, and I'd probably say first off, it's not like they have to do some work, right? So the providers have to tap into our APIs, into our automation to be able to abstract a layer. Like we've got a couple of tools out there. We've got a service provider console, which is like a proxy to our other services, calls in the APIs. They can then talk to that to create their offerings. It's actually an evolution of what they were doing with, say, VMware, right? With VCD or whatever it was, right? But now they're just doing that using the automation to be able to build the services. And they're now building, they call them their own frameworks. So they have their framework when a customer comes to them, and they can use bits of their framework, and that framework might plug into our services. So whether it plugs into Kasten, whether it plugs into our backup for AWS, or even on VMC, they might still use the classic Veeam backup and replication. That's what they're now controlling. So we definitely give them the tooling to be able to do that, but they've got to do that little bit of work still.
So Michael, talk to me about this portability piece. We're recording this at AWS, so we're going to keep the conversation confined to an AWS conversation, but I harken back to the days where I was backing up my Hyper-V in my vSphere environment, and I could kind of use this Veeam abstraction to restore to either platform. As I look at my AWS environment, I have EC2 that I'm backing up with Veeam, then I have VMware Cloud on AWS that I'm backing up in Veeam. Does that kind of abstraction still hold up?
Yeah, so for any of those image-based backups, right? So whether it's physical, virtual machines, and there's obviously a long list of virtualization. You mentioned two just then, but RHV and lots of other image-based backups for virtualization. Then you've got the clouds from a compute point of view. All of those backups from us are stored in a VBK format. Now, you don't need to know like the acronym or anything for that, but it's like a zip file. So wherever we've taken that backup, we've got the ability to instantly recover an EC2 instance back into VMware. So actually stream that data back into an on-premises virtualization VMware environment, but then equally be able to directly restore that into any of the other big hyperscalers, but AWS being one of them. So that allows us to take physical and virtual machines from on-premises and actually restore them up into AWS as EC2 instances as well. And we can manipulate what that looks like. So just because it had 4 gig of RAM on premises, we can give it 16 gig of RAM when it goes to an EC2. So we can transform what that looks like as it goes through that process. Obviously, we can automate that as well. So you can put that all into a way of being able to provide disaster recovery or automated recovery, or maybe automated testing as well for that data set. But that portable data format is obviously the lifeblood of Veeam in terms of, we started with a VBK that we made 10 years ago is still available for us to be able to recover that wherever you want.
Yeah, so while we're recording this at AWS reInvent, we're not beholden to them because this is still the CTO Advisor studio. So I want to talk a little bit about what you just hit on. Workload portability is a thing that I've been researching for quite some time. I've used Veeam to back up an EC2 instance and then repatriate that into the CTO Advisor Hyper infrastructure because it made sense. That's where it made sense to run workloads. as I think about like this image-based backup capability, how is Veeam thinking about other types of backup that may not be image-based, but I still want to, I want this portability across clouds or across infrastructure.
So if let's take unstructured data for an example, right? So NAS-based data, SMB, NFS data that we have on premises, maybe we're using a well-known NAS enterprise storage system, but we want to take advantage of EFS because we're here.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the Elastic File System. We've got the ability to restore that unstructured data and be that migration tool as well to move that into EFS. We see it as a file system. We don't really care about the underpinning, but then when we get up there, how do you then protect it? Well, we have Veeam Backup for AWS that then allows us to protect EFS as well. So again, it's that continuation of how you protect it using that single interface, that VBR interface that allows us to protect all of the services.
And then from a sysadmin perspective, or even from a developer perspective, it's just the Veeam API. I don't care if it's EFS or NFS or some other file system behind it. The process to back up the unstructured data is the same process.
Yeah, pretty similar. Obviously, there's some differences when you look at EFS and their API and what NFS looks like on premises. Same with different storage vendors. So we have integration on premises with some of those enterprise storage systems that allow us to use their storage snapshots to then suck the data out of that. So, but relatively, yes, it's going to look and feel the same way. We're just abstracting the complexities of that.
So I'm talking with two principal technologists. What are your titles at?
They flow. Depends on the day.
Okay.
Depends on the day.
Why are they here at AWS reInvent?
Oh yeah. So I would say lead technologist, cloud and service provider here.
Okay.
Yeah, technologists for cloud native.
And there's a lot of complexity here. Right before we started the interview, we were talking about control plane IO and the need to abstract away from the services. Here at AWS reInvent, they announced a ton of data services. Too much to digest even on this show, and we're talking about data protection. I think that's a great conversation for another day. But we also talked about the abstraction of managing the data, which is a huge problem as I think about whether my data is in GCP or AWS or on-prem. I have the same team to be able to manage it with. The challenge when you talk to the Veeams of the world is to challenge these folks on exactly how do you do this practically. I hope we brought a little bit of that conversation. Both these folks are on Twitter. I'll link the Twitter handles below. But if you can't get a hold of them directly, you have a question for me and you want me to ask them, I will ask them the question. I'll be the proxy. I'll abstract Veeam folks for you. If you want to learn more about the CTO Advisor, you can follow us on the web, thectoadvisor.com. Again, if you want to DM me your questions, it's at CTO Advisor on Twitter. Talk to you next. CTO Advisor Studio from Las Vegas.